Sarah Martinez stood in the bridal suite of the Grand Oaks Country Club, adjusting her veil one final time before what should have been the happiest day of her life. The silk dress cascaded perfectly around her, a far cry from the hand-me-down clothes she'd worn growing up in Pine Ridge Mobile Home Park. But as she caught her reflection in the ornate mirror, she couldn't shake the memory of her future mother-in-law's words from the rehearsal dinner the night before. Those words that cut deeper than any blade. "I don't know what my son sees in trailer trash like you." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Whitmore had said it with a smile, of course. The kind of smile that fooled everyone else in the room, but left Sarah feeling like she'd been slapped. Even now, hours later, the sting lingered. What Margaret didn't know, what nobody in that pristine country club knew, was the federal badge hidden in Sarah's purse, the one that represented 15 years of clawing her way from poverty to the highest levels of law enforcement. The badge that would soon turn Margaret's world upside down in ways she never saw coming. The wedding ceremony had been perfect, despite Margaret's subtle attempts to undermine it. Sarah's dress had somehow gotten accidentally splashed with red wine during photos. The seating arrangements had been mysteriously changed, relegating Sarah's family to the back corners. But Sarah had smiled through it all, knowing that her real victory was yet to come. As she and David exchanged vows, she caught Margaret's disapproving glare from the front row, that same condescending expression that had haunted their entire engagement. The reception was where things truly began to unravel. Margaret had positioned herself as the unofficial hostess, directing staff and making subtle digs at Sarah's background whenever possible. During her toast, she managed to work in a comment about how different backgrounds can sometimes work out, her eyes fixed on Sarah with barely concealed disdain. The other guests laughed politely, but Sarah saw the calculation behind every word. This wasn't just snobbery, it was warfare. Sarah had grown up in Pine Ridge, a mobile home community on the outskirts of Millbrook County. Her mother, Elena, worked double shifts at the local diner to keep food on the table after Sarah's father disappeared when she was 8. The trailer they called home was clean but cramped, and Sarah learned early that the world judged you by your address before they knew your character. She'd excelled in school, despite having to study by candlelight when the electricity was shut off, despite wearing the same pair of shoes until the soles wore through, despite the whispers that followed her through the hallways of Millbrook High. College had been a distant dream until her guidance counselor, Mrs. Chen, pulled her aside senior year. She'd helped Sarah navigate scholarship applications, driven her to interviews at State University, and even bought her interview clothes with her own money. She remembered the day her acceptance letter arrived, how her mother cried tears of joy, while Sarah stood frozen, hardly believing that someone like her could really escape Pine Ridge. Criminal justice had called to her from the beginning. Maybe it was growing up watching her mother struggle against systems that seemed designed to keep them down, or maybe it was the detective who'd actually listened when Sarah reported the domestic violence in the trailer next door. Whatever the reason, Sarah threw herself into her studies with fierce determination. She graduated summa cum laude, earned her way into Quantico, and spent the next decade building a reputation as one of the Bureau's most tenacious investigators. But none of that mattered to Margaret Whitmore. To her, Sarah would always be the girl from the trailer park who'd somehow tricked her precious son into marriage. Margaret came from old Millbrook money.
In Millbrook society, few things were more sacred than animal welfare, and Margaret's fall from grace was complete. The woman who'd spent years positioning herself as the moral center of their community had been exposed as a common thief. David stared at his mother, pieces clicking into place. The expensive renovations to her house last year, the sudden European vacation, the designer clothes she claimed were gifts from friends. It all made horrible sense now. "Mom," he said quietly, "tell me this isn't true." Margaret looked around the room at faces that had once smiled at her with respect and admiration. Now she saw shock, disgust, and the particular kind of fascination that comes with watching someone's reputation implode in real time. These were her peers, her social circle, the people whose opinions had shaped her entire identity. And now they all knew exactly what she really was. "This is all a misunderstanding," she said desperately. "I can explain everything. The charity work is complicated. There are administrative costs." "Administrative costs don't typically include luxury vacations and jewelry," Sarah replied. She turned to David, her expression softening slightly. "I'm sorry you have to find out this way, on our wedding day, but..." She forced my hand. David looked between his wife and his mother, the weight of betrayal settling over him. "How long have you known?" he asked Sarah. "I suspected something 3 months ago, when she started making comments about money and suggesting I was only marrying you for financial security. People who embezzle money tend to assume everyone else is as motivated by greed as they are. I started looking into her finances as a precaution, just to protect us from any potential scandal. I never expected to find this much." Margaret tried one last desperate play, reaching for the righteous indignation that had served her so well over the years. "You planned this," she accused. "You deliberately ruined my son's wedding to get revenge on me." Sarah gathered the documents back into their folder with methodical precision. "Actually, Margaret, I planned to let this go. The investigation would have proceeded quietly, and you probably would have gotten away with a plea bargain and community service. But then you called me trailer trash in front of my husband and tried to buy me off with stolen charity money." She paused, letting that sink in. "So, yes, I suppose you could say I planned this. Just like I planned my escape from Pine Ridge, my college education, my FBI career, and my marriage to your son. The difference is my plans were built on hard work and integrity. Yours were built on theft and lies." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of sirens in the distance. Sarah had made the call before approaching Margaret, knowing that a public confrontation would leave no room for backroom deals or family pressure to make the charges disappear. "Those would be my colleagues from the Bureau's Financial Crimes Unit," Sarah said conversationally. "They should be here any minute to place you under arrest. I thought you'd prefer to be taken into custody here, in front of all your society friends, rather than having agents show up at your house tomorrow morning. Consider it a wedding gift." Margaret's legs gave out and she sank into her chair as the full reality of her situation hit home. Her reputation was destroyed, her freedom was forfeit, and the daughter-in-law she'd spent months trying to humiliate had orchestrated her downfall with surgical precision. David put his arm around Sarah's waist, finally seeing his wife clearly for perhaps the first time. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have listened to you about her. I should have protected you." Sarah leaned into him, feeling the weight of years of struggle and determination finally paying off. "You couldn't have known. People like your mother are experts at hiding their true nature behind respectability and social connections. But people like me, people who grew up watching every penny, who know what real hardship looks like, we recognize thieves when we see them." The FBI agent.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Arrived as the reception guests watched in fascination. Margaret Whitmore, who had spent her entire adult life believing that money and social status placed her above consequences, was read her rights in front of 200 of Millbrook's most influential citizens. The Miranda warning echoed through the country club's marble-floored ballroom, each word hammering another nail into the coffin of her reputation. As they led Margaret away in handcuffs, she turned back towards Sarah with one last desperate attempt at defiance. "You think you've won something," she called out, "but you'll never truly belong here. You'll always be that girl from the trailer park." Sarah smiled, the same serene smile she'd worn throughout their months of conflict. "You're absolutely right, Margaret. I'll always be that girl from the trailer park, the one who worked harder than everyone around her, who earned everything she has, who built a career on integrity and justice. And now I'm also the FBI agent who's sending you to federal prison." She paused, savoring the moment. "I couldn't be prouder of my background." The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Margaret's crimes. Over 4 years, she had systematically looted 12 different charitable organizations, stealing more than $300,000 meant for children's programs, animal welfare, homeless services, and environmental protection. She had used her position on various boards to forge signatures, manipulate bank records, and redirect funds to personal accounts she'd established under slight variations of the charity's names. The Millbrook community was rocked by the revelations. Margaret had been the face of philanthropy in their insular social world, the woman who organized fundraisers and charity galas, who was photographed presenting oversized checks to worthy causes. Learning that those same checks had been systematically emptied by the woman holding them created a crisis of trust that rippled through every social circle and charitable organization in town. Sarah found herself in the unusual position of being both the agent who'd broken the case and the daughter-in-law of the defendant. She recused herself from the formal investigation to avoid any conflict of interest, but her initial financial analysis became the foundation of the federal case against Margaret. The evidence was so overwhelming that Margaret's high-priced attorneys advised her to accept a plea bargain rather than risk a trial that would only heap additional humiliation on her already destroyed reputation. David struggled with the aftermath more than Sarah had expected. He'd grown up worshiping his mother, believing her to be the embodiment of grace and moral authority. Learning that she was a criminal who'd stolen money from vulnerable populations shattered his entire worldview. He spent weeks in therapy trying to reconcile the loving mother he remembered with the calculating thief she'd revealed herself to be. Sarah stood by him through it all, understanding better than most how family betrayal could shake someone to their core. Her own father's abandonment had taught her that the people who were supposed to love and protect you could inflict the deepest wounds. But she'd also learned that those wounds could make you stronger if you didn't let them define you. The trial became a media sensation, partly because of the dramatic wedding confrontation, but mostly because Margaret's crimes had touched so many lives. The children who didn't receive educational support, the animals that went without medical care, the homeless individuals who lost access to services, their stories filled the courtroom during victim impact statements. Sarah watched from the gallery as person after person described how Margaret's greed had directly harmed the most vulnerable members of their community. Margaret received a sentence of 8 years in federal prison, with restitution ordered for the full amount stolen, plus interest and penalties. The judge noted the particular cruelty of stealing from charitable organizations, calling it, quote, a betrayal of the public trust that strikes at
The very heart of our community's willingness to help those in need. As they left the courthouse after sentencing, David turned to Sarah with a mixture of gratitude and regret. I keep thinking about all the times she criticized you, all the comments about your background. She was projecting her own criminality onto you the entire time. Sarah squeezed his hand. People who steal always assume others are stealing too. People who lie assume others are lying. She couldn't understand that someone might work hard and achieve things honestly because she'd never done it herself. The aftermath brought unexpected changes to Sarah and David's life in Millbrook. Some of Margaret's former social circle initially blamed Sarah for the family's downfall, whispering that she should have handled things privately to avoid embarrassing the community. But as more details of Margaret's crimes emerged, public opinion shifted decisively. Sarah became seen as the hero who'd protected countless future victims by exposing a serial thief who'd hidden behind charitable work. The charitable organizations that had been victimized by Margaret's schemes asked Sarah to serve on their reconstituted boards, recognizing that her investigative skills and personal integrity made her ideal for preventing future fraud. She accepted positions with 3 organizations, using her law enforcement background to establish new financial oversight procedures that became models for nonprofits throughout the region. Sarah's mother, Elena, visited from Pine Ridge for the first time since the wedding, marveling at the beautiful home David and Sarah had built together. As they sat on the back porch watching the sunset, Elena shook her head in amazement. I always knew you were special, mija, but I never imagined you'd become someone who could take down the queen of Millbrook society. I didn't take her down, Mama, Sarah replied. She took herself down through her own choices. I just made sure she faced consequences for those choices. Elena smiled, the pride evident in her weathered face. Your father walking out on us was the worst thing that ever happened to our family. But watching you grow into the woman you've become, strong, honest, unafraid to stand up for what's right, that's the best thing. He missed out on knowing the most incredible person. 2 years later, Sarah was promoted to senior special agent and transferred to head the FBI's new financial crimes task force for the southeastern region. Her success with the Margaret Whitmore case had garnered national attention, and she was now considered an expert in charity fraud and nonprofit embezzlement. She spoke at conferences across the country, teaching other agents how to recognize the warning signs of financial abuse in charitable organizations. David thrived in his work as a civil rights attorney, finding purpose in representing victims of discrimination and workplace abuse. He often said that watching Sarah stand up to his mother had taught him the importance of fighting for justice even when it was uncomfortable or costly. Their marriage grew stronger through the challenges they'd faced, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared values that no amount of family drama could shake. Margaret served her full sentence, emerging from federal prison to find that the Millbrook social world she'd once dominated had moved on without her. Her former friends avoided her, charitable organizations wanted nothing to do with her, and even the country club where she'd held court for decades had quietly revoked her membership. She moved to a small apartment in a neighboring county, working as a bookkeeper for a local business, a job she obtained only because she didn't disclose her criminal record on the application. Sarah occasionally ran into Margaret at the grocery store or post office, encounters that were awkward but no longer painful. Margaret had aged considerably during her imprisonment, the proud bearing replaced by a defeated slouch that spoke of dreams permanently deferred. Sarah felt no satisfaction in seeing her former adversary's downfall. A sense of justice served and community protected. The Pine Ridge Mobile Home Park, where Sarah had grown up, underwent revitalization during her years in Millbrook, partly funded by recovered proceeds from Margaret's crimes that were redirected to community development programs. Sarah attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new community center, built on the lot where her childhood trailer had once stood. She spoke to the gathered residents about the importance of education and perseverance, about how circumstances of birth don't determine destiny. I used to be ashamed of growing up here, she told the crowd, which included many families facing the same struggles she'd experienced. I thought I had to hide my past to succeed in the world, but I learned something important. Your background isn't something to overcome, it's something that makes you who you are. The challenges you face here are teaching you skills that privileged people never learn: resourcefulness, resilience, and the ability to recognize what really matters. After the ceremony, Sarah walked through the improved park with David, pointing out landmarks from her childhood. The community center stood where her trailer had been, but she could still see the outline of their small yard where her mother had grown tomatoes and coffee cans, and where Sarah had done homework at a card table every night after school. "Do you ever regret how everything happened?" David asked. "The confrontation at our wedding, the public nature of it all?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I regret that your mother chose to commit crimes. I regret that she treated me with such cruelty and disdain. But I don't regret exposing her or holding her accountable. She stole money from organizations trying to help vulnerable people, and she tried to buy me off with that same stolen money. Those actions deserved consequences, regardless of family relationships or social standing." They drove home to their house on Elm Street, a modest but comfortable home they'd chosen together rather than accepting the family mansion that David had inherited. Sarah had insisted they make their own way, building something that belonged entirely to them rather than living surrounded by reminders of family dysfunction and inherited wealth. That evening, Sarah received a call from the Bureau offering her a position in Washington, D.C., heading a new national task force focused on nonprofit fraud.
It was the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to take the lessons learned from the Margaret Whitmore case and apply them on a national scale. She would be in charge of developing new investigative techniques, training agents across the country, and working with Congress on legislation to strengthen oversight of charitable organizations. She discussed the offer with David over dinner, weighing the professional opportunity against their settled life in Millbrook. David was immediately supportive, recognizing that this was Sarah's chance to have a national impact on issues she cared deeply about. They decided to accept the position, with David planning to join a civil rights firm in D.C. that specialized in federal discrimination cases. As they prepared for the move, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from Pine Ridge to the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Every challenge had taught her something valuable. Poverty had taught her resourcefulness. Her father's abandonment had taught her self-reliance. Margaret's cruelty had taught her to stand up for herself. And success had taught her the importance of lifting others as she climbed. The day before they left Millbrook, Sarah made one final visit to the cemetery where her grandmother was buried. Rosa Martinez had raised Sarah during the early years when her mother was working multiple jobs, and she'd been the first person to tell Sarah that she was destined for great things. Sarah placed fresh flowers on the grave and whispered a promise to continue making her family proud. "I wish you could see where I've ended up, Abuela," she said softly. "That little girl you used to read stories to."
You could see where I've ended up, Abuela, she said softly. That little girl you used to read stories to is going to Washington to fight for people who can't fight for themselves, just like you taught me to do. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of honeysuckle and the sound of children playing in the distance. Sarah took it as a sign of approval from the woman who'd shaped her understanding of right and wrong, who taught her that true nobility came from character rather than circumstances. As she walked back to her car, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from her new supervisor in D.C. "Looking forward to having you on the team, Agent Martinez. Your reputation precedes you, and we have some cases that could really benefit from your expertise." Sarah smiled as she read the message, thinking about the investigation skills she'd honed in places like this quiet cemetery, learning to read between the lines and see truth hidden beneath surface appearances. Margaret Whitmore had underestimated her because of her background, assuming that someone from a trailer park couldn't possibly threaten someone of her social standing. It had been a costly mistake, one that would ultimately protect countless potential victims from similar schemes. The drive to D.C. took Sarah and David through small towns and cities across 3 states, each with their own trailer parks and mobile home communities where children were learning the same lessons Sarah had learned about perseverance and determination. She made a mental note to ensure her new task force paid particular attention to rural communities where charity fraud often went undetected longer because of limited oversight resources. Their new life in the capital would bring fresh challenges and opportunities, but Sarah carried with her the lessons learned in Millbrook and Pine Ridge. She understood now that her background had been her greatest asset all along, not something to hide or overcome, but something to celebrate and leverage in service of justice. The girl who'd once studied by candlelight was now positioned to illuminate corruption wherever it hid, and she intended to make the most of that opportunity. The trailer park where Sarah Martinez had learned to dream big had produced exactly what it intended, a person who would never forget where she came from, who would always fight for the underdog, and who understood that true success meant using your position to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Margaret Whitmore's attempt to humiliate her had backfired spectacularly, revealing instead the character and competence that would define Sarah's career for decades to come. Sarah's first weeks in Washington brought a whirlwind of briefings, case files, and meetings that stretched from dawn until well past dinner. The National Nonprofit Fraud Task Force operated out of a sleek office building in Arlington, just across the Potomac from the Capitol. Her team consisted of 12 seasoned agents, each bringing expertise from different financial crime specialties. The scope of their mandate was staggering, investigating charitable fraud across all 50 states, coordinating with international agencies on cross-border schemes, and developing new detection methods for increasingly sophisticated financial crimes. The Whitmore case had opened doors Sarah never expected.
Her methodology for tracking diverted funds through shell accounts and subsidiary organizations had become required reading at Quantico. Law enforcement agencies from Canada to Australia were requesting copies of her investigative protocols. But with recognition came pressure. Every new case was measured against the success of exposing Margaret's embezzlement, and Sarah felt the weight of expectations from colleagues who assumed she could work miracles with financial records. David had seamlessly transitioned to his new position with the Civil Rights Defense League, a nonprofit law firm that handled discrimination cases across the federal circuit. His work complemented Sarah's perfectly. While she investigated financial crimes that victimized vulnerable populations, he provided legal aid to those unfairly targeted because of their ethnicity, gender, or beliefs.
Representation to individuals facing workplace discrimination and civil rights violations. They often found themselves working different angles of the same systemic problems, both fighting to protect people who lacked the resources to protect themselves. Their first major case in D.C. came through an unlikely source. Sarah was reviewing quarterly reports from regional FBI offices when she noticed a pattern of complaints from the Pacific Northwest. 3 different charity watchdog organizations had flagged unusual activity surrounding disaster relief funds allocated after a devastating wildfire season. The amounts seemed too small to warrant federal attention. A few thousand here, a few thousand there. But the geographic clustering caught Sarah's attention. She pulled the files and spread them across her conference room table, the same methodical approach she'd used to unravel Margaret's scheme. Relief organizations in Oregon, Washington, and Northern California were reporting discrepancies between donated funds and actual aid distributed. The thefts were sophisticated, designed to fly under the radar of typical oversight mechanisms. Someone with deep knowledge of disaster relief protocols was systematically skimming money from multiple organizations while maintaining the appearance of legitimate operations. The investigation led Sarah's team to Phoenix Financial Services, a consulting firm that specialized in helping nonprofits manage disaster response funding. The company was founded by Dr. Marcus Chen, a former FEMA administrator with impeccable credentials and a reputation for efficient crisis management. His firm had contracts with dozens of relief organizations across the western states, providing financial oversight and distribution logistics when natural disasters overwhelmed local capacity. On paper, Phoenix Financial was exactly what disaster relief organizations needed: professional financial management during chaotic emergency responses. But Sarah's analysis revealed subtle inconsistencies in their reporting. Emergency supply purchases that cost slightly more than market rates, administrative fees that crept higher with each contract renewal, transportation costs that didn't align with actual fuel prices or delivery distances. Individually, each discrepancy was too small to trigger automatic audits. Collectively, they represented millions of dollars diverted from disaster victims over a 5-year period. Dr. Chen proved to be a master of misdirection. Unlike Margaret Whitmore's crude embezzlement scheme, his operation was sophisticated enough to pass most standard audits. He maintained legitimate offices in 3 states, employed actual financial professionals, and even distributed real aid to disaster victims. The theft was embedded so deeply within legitimate operations that it appeared to be simple administrative efficiency rather than systematic fraud.
They lacked the financial expertise to detect sophisticated fraud and were grateful for professional assistance during overwhelming situations. By positioning himself as an expert helper, Dr. Chen had gained access to funds at precisely the moments when oversight was most difficult and theft was least likely to be detected. The emotional impact of the crimes became clear as Sarah's team interviewed disaster victims who had received reduced aid due to Dr. Chen's skimming. Families who had lost everything in wildfires received smaller emergency payments because administrative fees had been inflated. Temporary housing assistance was cut short because transportation costs had been artificially elevated. Children went without school supplies because procurement contracts had been manipulated to generate excess profits for Phoenix Financial.
Sarah found herself thinking frequently about her own childhood experiences with poverty during this investigation. She remembered the desperation of needing help and the gratitude that came with receiving it. Dr. Chen had exploited that vulnerability, stealing from people at their most desperate moments while maintaining the facade of humanitarian assistance. It was a level of calculated cruelty that reminded her of Margaret's attempt to buy her off with stolen charity money. The case took an unexpected turn when David's civil rights work intersected with Sarah's investigation. He was representing several Latino families who claimed they had been systematically excluded from disaster relief assistance in Northern California. Their allegations initially seemed unrelated to the financial fraud Sarah was investigating, but deeper analysis revealed a disturbing pattern. Phoenix Financial's aid distribution protocols had subtle biases built into their eligibility criteria, resulting in reduced assistance for immigrant families and communities of color. The discrimination wasn't explicit enough to trigger civil rights enforcement under normal circumstances, but it was consistent enough to be intentional. Dr. Chen had designed his fraud to disproportionately impact the most vulnerable disaster victims, people who were least likely to complain about reduced assistance and least able to navigate complex bureaucratic appeals processes. It was a deliberate choice to victimize those who couldn't fight back, adding layers of moral outrage to an already despicable scheme. Working together on the case brought Sarah and David closer than they had been since their wedding day. They spent evenings at their kitchen table, sharing information and insights across their different areas of expertise. Sarah's financial analysis provided evidence of systematic theft, while David's civil rights investigation revealed the discriminatory impact of that theft. Together, they built a comprehensive case that addressed both the financial crimes and the civil rights violations embedded within Dr. Chen's operation. The arrest came during a disaster relief conference in Seattle, where Dr. Chen was scheduled to deliver a keynote address on ethical financial management and crisis response. Sarah watched from the audience as he spoke eloquently about the moral obligations of relief organizations, about the sacred trust between donors and disaster victims, about the importance of transparency and accountability in charitable operations. His words rang hollow knowing what she knew about his systematic theft from the very populations he claimed to serve. Federal agents moved in as Dr. Chen finished his presentation to thunderous applause from an audience that still believed he was a humanitarian leader. The arrest was broadcast live on social media by conference attendees, creating a viral moment that exposed the stunning hypocrisy of his public persona versus his criminal reality. Within hours, news outlets across the country were reporting on the case, with particular attention to the sophisticated methods Dr. Chen had used to steal from disaster victims.
For holding consulting firms accountable for systematic theft from charitable organizations. Dr. Chen received a 15-year federal sentence, the longest ever imposed for disaster relief fraud. More importantly, his conviction led to comprehensive reforms in how relief organizations managed financial operations during emergency responses. Sarah testified before congressional committees about the need for stronger oversight of disaster relief funding, helping to draft legislation that established new reporting requirements and audit protocols for emergency aid distribution. Her recommendations were incorporated into the Federal Disaster Relief Integrity Act, which created standardized financial controls for all federally funded emergency assistance programs. The success of the Phoenix Financial case elevated Sarah's reputation within federal law enforcement circles, but it also brought unexpected personal challenges. Her expertise in nonprofit fraud made her a target for wealthy individuals and organizations who wanted to discredit potential investigations before they began. She received anonymous threats, had her personal finances scrutinized by private investigators hired by unknown clients, and discovered that her phone calls were being monitored by sophisticated surveillance equipment. David's civil rights work also attracted unwanted attention from powerful interests who preferred to keep discriminatory practices hidden from public scrutiny. Their home was burglarized twice, though nothing valuable was taken, a clear message that someone could reach them anytime they wanted. Sarah installed professional security systems and began varying her daily routines, practices she'd learned during her early FBI training but never expected to need in her personal life. The harassment campaign escalated when Sarah was assigned to investigate the Meridian Foundation, one of the largest charitable organizations in the United States. The foundation managed over $2 billion in donated funds annually, supporting everything from international development projects to domestic education initiatives. On the surface, Meridian appeared to be a model of charitable efficiency, with low administrative costs and impressive program outcomes documented in glossy annual reports. But Sarah's preliminary analysis revealed troubling patterns in Meridian's international operations. Money designated for schools in developing countries was being diverted through shell companies registered in tax havens. Medical supplies purchased for refugee camps were being sold on secondary markets at significant profits. Infrastructure projects funded by donor contributions were being completed at fractions of their reported costs, with the savings disappearing into untracked accounts. The scope of the potential fraud was staggering. Hundreds of millions of dollars that should have reached vulnerable populations around the world were instead flowing into a complex web of subsidiary organizations controlled by Meridian's leadership. It was international charity fraud on a scale that dwarfed anything Sarah had previously investigated, with victims scattered across dozens of countries and multiple legal jurisdictions. Meridian's board of directors read like a roster of American political and business elite. Former senators, retired cabinet secretaries, Fortune 500 CEOs, and prominent philanthropists lent their names and reputations to the organization's fundraising efforts. Several board members had close connections to current political leadership, making any investigation inherently sensitive from a political perspective. Sarah's superiors at the FBI initially expressed reluctance to pursue the Meridian investigation aggressively, citing concerns about political blowback and diplomatic complications. The Foundation's international operations involved partnerships with foreign governments and international aid organizations, creating jurisdictional complexities that could strain relationships with allied nations. But Sarah's evidence was too compelling to ignore, and public pressure was building as news of the preliminary investigation leaked to investigative journalists. The breakthrough came when Sarah's team located a whistleblower within Meridian's financial operations. Jennifer Walsh had worked as a senior accountant for the Foundation for 8 years, gradually becoming aware of systematic irregularities in international project funding. She had documented her concerns internally, only to be reassigned to domestic operations and warned about maintaining confidentiality regarding sensitive financial information. Jennifer provided Sarah's team with internal documents that revealed the full scope of Meridian's fraudulent operations. Project budgets were routinely inflated before being submitted to donors, with the excess funds diverted to accounts controlled by Foundation executives. Local contractors in developing countries were paid substantially less than amounts reported to donors, with the differences flowing back to Meridian leadership through complex financial arrangements. Most damaging were email communications between Meridian executives discussing how to maximize administrative flexibility in international projects. The emails revealed conscious decisions to target the most desperate populations for fraudulent schemes, calculating that refugees and disaster victims were least likely to complain about reduced assistance or delayed project completion. Sarah found herself working 18-hour days, coordinating with international law enforcement agencies and trying to trace financial flows across multiple countries and currencies. The investigation required cooperation from governments that didn't always share information freely, particularly when their own officials might be implicated in Meridian schemes. Some foreign partnerships had involved direct payments to government officials, adding corruption charges to the growing list of federal crimes. The personal toll was significant. Sarah and David's marriage was strained by the demands of the investigation and the constant security concerns that surrounded their daily lives. They rarely socialized anymore, unable to trust that casual conversations wouldn't be monitored by interests seeking to undermine the case. Sarah's mother called less frequently, worried that phone contact might somehow endanger her daughter's work. The case consumed Sarah's thoughts even during rare moments of downtime. She would find herself analyzing financial documents while grocery shopping, noting how legitimate transactions differed from the fraudulent patterns she was tracking. Restaurant bills reminded her of inflated procurement costs in Meridian's overseas projects. Even mundane activities became viewed through the lens of financial investigation. David tried to provide emotional support while managing his own demanding caseload,
but the stress was evident in their increasingly tense conversations about work and security. They began seeing a marriage counselor, recognizing that the pressures of their careers were affecting their relationship in ways that neither had anticipated. The counselor helped them establish boundaries between professional obligations and personal time, though those boundaries were frequently tested by the urgency of ongoing investigations. The Meridian case also highlighted the international scope of modern charity fraud, requiring Sarah to develop expertise in cross-border financial crimes and work with agencies she'd never previously encountered. She spent weeks in training sessions with Treasury Department specialists who taught her how to track cryptocurrency transactions and offshore banking arrangements. The technical complexity of modern financial crimes required constant learning and adaptation to stay ahead of increasingly sophisticated criminal schemes. Sarah's testimony before international law enforcement conferences became highly sought after as agencies around the world struggled to keep pace with globalized charity fraud. Her presentation on the Meridian investigation at an Interpol conference in Lyon drew representatives from
43 countries, all seeking to understand how such large-scale theft could operate undetected for years within supposedly reputable charitable organizations. The investigation's complexity was compounded by Meridian's use of cutting-edge financial technology to obscure money flows. Smart contracts on blockchain networks were being used to automate fund transfers in ways that created layers of technical obscurity around simple theft. Sarah had to learn programming languages and cryptocurrency protocols to understand how digital tools were being weaponized for financial fraud. Working with technology specialists from the FBI's cyber division, Sarah developed new investigative techniques for tracking charitable funds through blockchain networks and digital currency exchanges. The methods they pioneered during the Meridian investigation became standard protocols for investigating tech-enabled financial crimes, contributing to a rapidly evolving field of law enforcement expertise. The case also revealed how legitimate technological innovations could be corrupted for criminal purposes. Meridian had positioned itself as a pioneer in using blockchain technology to increase transparency and efficiency in charitable operations. Their marketing materials emphasized how donors could track their contributions through every stage of project implementation, creating an impression of unprecedented accountability and oversight. In reality, the blockchain systems were designed to create complexity rather than transparency. Multiple cryptocurrency exchanges and smart contract interactions made it virtually impossible for ordinary donors to verify that their contributions were actually reaching intended beneficiaries. The technology that was supposed to prevent fraud was instead being used to enable it on an unprecedented scale. Sarah's investigation required her to become fluent in technical concepts that had barely existed when she began her FBI career. She spent hours studying white papers on distributed ledger technologies, learning to distinguish between legitimate innovations and criminal misuse of digital financial tools. The educational process was exhausting but necessary. Modern financial crimes required modern investigative techniques. The personal impact of the Meridian investigation extended beyond the professional challenges to affect Sarah's fundamental understanding of charitable work itself. Growing up in poverty, she had always viewed charitable organizations as inherently good, as institutions that existed solely to help people in need. The systematic exploitation she was uncovering forced her to develop a more sophisticated understanding of how noble missions could be corrupted by criminal leadership. She began to see patterns in how fraudulent charities operated, how they used emotional appeals and moral authority to discourage scrutiny, how they targeted the most vulnerable populations specifically because those victims were least able to seek accountability, how they wrapped theft in the language of humanitarian concern to deflect suspicion. These insights would prove crucial as her career continued to evolve, but they came at the cost of a certain innocence about the charitable sector. The Meridian investigation was approaching its climax when Sarah received an unexpected phone call that would change everything. The caller identified himself as Thomas Rodriguez, a senior official with the Office of Inspector General for the Department of Health and Human Services. He had been following Sarah's work on nonprofit fraud and wanted to discuss a case that might benefit from her expertise. Rodriguez explained that his office had been investigating irregularities in federal grant distributions to medical research organizations, but the case had stalled due to its technical complexity and political sensitivity. The investigation involved potential fraud in cancer research funding, with millions of dollars in federal grants possibly being diverted from actual research into personal accounts controlled by prominent scientists and medical administrators.
The case had been languishing for months because traditional auditing approaches were inadequate for detecting the sophisticated fraud schemes being employed. Rodriguez had read about Sarah's innovative techniques for tracking diverted funds through complex financial networks and believed her expertise might be the key to breaking the case open. He was requesting her temporary assignment to a joint task force that would combine FBI financial crime expertise with Health and Human Services investigative resources. Sarah was intrigued by the possibility of applying her skills to medical research fraud, a field where theft directly impacted efforts to develop treatments for life-threatening diseases. Cancer research fraud was particularly reprehensible because it undermined efforts to save lives while exploiting the hope and desperation of patients and families facing terminal diagnoses. If criminals were stealing money designated for cancer research, every day of delay in their prosecution potentially cost lives. The medical research investigation would require Sarah to learn entirely new technical vocabularies and understand how scientific funding operated within academic and pharmaceutical contexts. But the challenge was appealing, and the potential impact was enormous. Successful prosecution of medical research fraud could recover millions of dollars for legitimate cancer research while preventing future thefts from similar programs. Rodriguez's call came at a perfect time in the Meridian investigation. Sarah's team had gathered sufficient evidence to support prosecutions, and the case was transitioning from active investigation to trial preparation. She could maintain oversight of the Meridian prosecution while dedicating primary attention to the medical research fraud case, leveraging her expertise across multiple high-impact investigations simultaneously. David supported the decision enthusiastically, recognizing that medical research fraud represented exactly the kind of case where Sarah's skills could have maximum social impact. They discussed the possibility that this new investigation might require travel to medical research centers around the country, potentially disrupting their still rebuilding personal life, but agreed that the opportunity was too important to decline. Sarah's acceptance of the medical research assignment marked another evolution in her career trajectory, from regional nonprofit fraud to international charity crimes to federal medical research investigations. Each case built upon previous experience while introducing new challenges and expanding her expertise into previously unexplored areas of white-collar crime. The progression reflected both her growing reputation within federal law enforcement and the increasing complexity of modern financial crimes that required specialized expertise to investigate effectively. The medical research fraud investigation thrust Sarah into a world where scientific breakthroughs were being systematically sabotaged by the very people entrusted to advance human knowledge. The Joint Task Force operated out of a secure facility in Bethesda, Maryland, just minutes from the National Institutes of Health campus. Sarah's new colleagues included medical fraud specialists, research integrity officers, and forensic accountants who understood the intricate funding mechanisms that supported American medical research. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the lead investigator from Health and Human Services, briefed Sarah on the scope of the suspected fraud during her first week on the assignment. The investigation centered on Pinnacle Bioresearch, a network of supposedly independent research institutions that had received over $400 million in federal cancer research grants over the past decade. On paper, Pinnacle's affiliated laboratories were producing groundbreaking research on experimental cancer treatments, publishing regularly in prestigious medical journals, and maintaining partnerships with major pharmaceutical companies. The reality was far different.
Sarah's analysis of Pinnacle's financial records revealed that research grants were being systematically diverted through a maze of shell companies and fake research projects. Expensive laboratory equipment was being purchased and immediately resold at substantial profits. Clinical trials were being conducted with far fewer patients than reported to federal agencies, with the saved costs flowing into personal accounts controlled by Pinnacle's leadership team. Most disturbing were the fabricated research results that Pinnacle had been submitting to justify continued funding. Promising cancer treatments that existed only on paper were being reported as successful in early-stage trials, generating additional grants for follow-up research that would never actually occur. The fraudulent results were sophisticated enough to pass peer review at medical journals, creating false hope for cancer patients and their families while undermining legitimate research efforts. Sarah found herself working closely with Dr. James Patterson, a former cancer researcher who had joined the Inspector General's office after witnessing research fraud firsthand during his academic career. Patterson helped Sarah understand how legitimate medical research operated, explaining the complex regulatory framework that governed clinical trials and the peer review processes that were supposed to prevent fraudulent research from reaching publication. The collaboration with Patterson proved crucial as Sarah began to decode Pinnacle's sophisticated fraud scheme. The organization had exploited every weakness in the medical research oversight system, from grant application reviews that relied heavily on reputation rather than verification, to publication processes that assumed good faith among researchers, to clinical trial monitoring that depended on self-reporting by the institutions conducting the research. Dr. Victor Kowalski, Pinnacle's founder and chief executive, had built his reputation on legitimate research early in his career, publishing influential papers on cancer cell metabolism that had earned him tenure at a prestigious medical school. But as federal research funding became increasingly competitive, Kowalski had gradually shifted from conducting actual research to fabricating results that would generate continued grant money. His early legitimate work provided credibility that helped him secure funding for increasingly fictitious projects. Sarah's investigation revealed that Kowalski had recruited a network of complicit researchers who were willing to put their names on fabricated studies in exchange for guaranteed funding and minimal actual work requirements. These researchers maintained the appearance of active scientific careers while producing virtually no legitimate research, instead focusing on creating convincing documentation for non-existent experiments and clinical trials. The human cost of Pinnacle's fraud became clear as Sarah interviewed cancer patients who had participated in what they believed were cutting-edge clinical trials. These patients had endured experimental treatments, risked serious side effects, and postponed other potential therapies based on their belief that they were contributing to promising cancer research. Learning that their suffering had been exploited to generate fraudulent data for grant applications was devastating for patients and families who had placed their trust in the medical research system. Sarah also discovered that Pinnacle's fraud had indirect effects that extended far beyond the immediate theft of grant money. Legitimate researchers were being denied funding because resources were being diverted to Kowalski's fictitious projects. Promising real research was being delayed or abandoned because Pinnacle's fabricated results were leading other scientists down false paths. The fraud was actively impeding progress toward actual cancer treatments while enriching criminals who exploited the desperation of cancer patients. The investigation required Sarah to master new technical skills, including statistical analysis of clinical trial data and understanding of laboratory procedures that could reveal whether reported experiments had actually been conducted.
She spent weeks learning to identify signs of data fabrication, from impossible statistical patterns in reported results to laboratory records that didn't match claimed experimental protocols.
Working with FBI forensic accountants, Sarah traced the flow of stolen research funds through an increasingly complex network of financial instruments. Kowalski had used cryptocurrency exchanges, offshore banking arrangements, and international real estate investments to launder money stolen from cancer research grants. The technical sophistication of his money laundering operation rivaled anything Sarah had encountered in her previous investigations. The breakthrough in the Pinnacle investigation came when Sarah's team located a former laboratory technician who had been fired after questioning discrepancies in research records. Marcus Thompson had worked in Pinnacle's flagship laboratory for 3 years, gradually becoming aware that experiments described in grant applications and research publications had never actually been conducted. When he raised concerns with laboratory supervisors, he was told that his job was to maintain equipment, not to question research protocols. Thompson provided Sarah's team with detailed documentation of Pinnacle's fraudulent practices, including laboratory notebooks that had been backdated to create false records of experiments, clinical trial protocols that bore no resemblance to actual patient treatments, and financial records showing how research funds were being diverted to personal accounts. His testimony would prove crucial in establishing the systematic nature of Pinnacle's fraud. The personal risks of investigating medical research fraud became apparent when Sarah began receiving threatening communications from unknown sources. Unlike the relatively straightforward intimidation tactics used against her during previous investigations, these threats were more subtle and sophisticated. Her medical insurance was mysteriously canceled due to administrative errors. Her personal physician received anonymous tips suggesting she was abusing prescription medications. Her car was repeatedly vandalized in ways that could have been random, but felt deliberately targeted. David's civil rights work was also being undermined through similar tactics. His law firm received anonymous complaints about his professional conduct that required time-consuming responses to bar association inquiries. His clients were being contacted by unknown individuals who claimed to represent alternative legal services that could better serve their needs. The harassment was designed to undermine their professional effectiveness without providing clear evidence of coordinated interference. Sarah recognized that the sophistication of the intimidation campaign suggested involvement by individuals with substantial resources and professional expertise. Medical research fraud generated enormous profits for perpetrators, creating incentives for elaborate efforts to protect criminal enterprises. The threats also indicated that her investigation was approaching sensitive information that powerful interests wanted to keep hidden. Working with FBI security specialists, Sarah implemented comprehensive personal protection measures that went far beyond anything she had previously required. Her communications were encrypted using government-grade security protocols. Her daily routines were systematically varied to prevent surveillance. Her home was equipped with professional-grade security systems that monitored approaches from multiple directions. The security measures proved necessary when Sarah's investigation uncovered connections between Pinnacle Bioresearch and several prominent pharmaceutical companies that had been unknowingly funding research based on fabricated data. These companies had invested millions of dollars in developing treatments based on Kowalski's fraudulent research results, only to discover that the promising compounds they were pursuing had never actually shown effectiveness in legitimate trials. The pharmaceutical industry
Connections added layers of complexity to the investigation, as legitimate companies sought to minimize their financial exposure while cooperating with federal investigators. Sarah found herself navigating corporate legal departments that wanted to provide assistance without admitting liability for their role in enabling fraud through inadequate due diligence. The delicate balance required careful coordination with corporate compliance officers, who were simultaneously protecting their company's interests and supporting the criminal investigation. Sarah's expertise in tracking diverted funds proved crucial in recovering money that could be returned to legitimate cancer research programs. Working with Treasury Department specialists, she identified assets that Kowalski had purchased with stolen research funds, including luxury real estate, rare artwork, and investment portfolios worth tens of millions of dollars.
Asset forfeiture proceedings would eventually recover most of the stolen money, allowing it to be redirected to genuine cancer research initiatives. The Pinnacle prosecution required extensive coordination with international law enforcement agencies, as Kowalski had used research collaborations with foreign institutions to move money across borders and obscure the sources of his wealth. Sarah worked with Interpol representatives to freeze assets in multiple countries and coordinate arrest warrants for Kowalski's international associates who had facilitated money laundering operations. The case also highlighted gaps in international cooperation on medical research fraud, as different countries had varying standards for research oversight and financial accountability. Sarah's recommendations for improved international coordination would influence future treaties on scientific research integrity and cross-border investigation of medical fraud. Dr. Morrison commended Sarah's work on developing new investigative protocols for medical research fraud that could be applied to future cases involving scientific misconduct. The techniques Sarah pioneered for analyzing laboratory records and clinical trial data became standard training materials for federal investigators specializing in research integrity violations. The successful prosecution of Viktor Kowalski and his associates resulted in prison sentences totaling over 80 years, with Kowalski himself receiving a 25-year federal sentence for fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy charges. More importantly, the case led to comprehensive reforms in how federal agencies monitored research grants and verified experimental results reported by funded institutions. Sarah testified before congressional committees on the need for stronger oversight of medical research funding, helping to draft legislation that required independent verification of clinical trial results and established new penalties for research fraud. Her recommendations were incorporated into the Medical Research Integrity Act, which created systematic auditing procedures for all federally funded medical research and established new criminal penalties specifically targeting scientific fraud. The medical research investigation elevated Sarah's profile within the federal law enforcement community to unprecedented levels. She was invited to join the Attorney General's White-Collar Crime Advisory Committee, providing strategic guidance on investigating complex financial crimes across multiple federal agencies. Her expertise was sought by prosecutors handling cases involving healthcare fraud, pharmaceutical crimes, and scientific misconduct. The success also brought new opportunities for international collaboration on financial crime investigation. Sarah was selected to represent the United States on an international task force developing global standards for investigating cross-border fraud involving charitable organizations and research institutions. The position required her to work with law enforcement agencies from dozens of countries, sharing expertise and coordinating investigations that spanned multiple jurisdictions. David's career had also flourished during this period, as his civil rights work gained national recognition for successfully challenging discriminatory practices in healthcare and education. He had argued several cases before federal appeals courts, establishing precedents that strengthened protections for vulnerable populations facing institutional discrimination. Their professional successes had strengthened their marriage, providing shared purpose and mutual respect that deepened their personal connection. The couple decided to purchase a larger home in Arlington, choosing a property that could accommodate the security requirements of Sarah's work while providing space for David's extensive legal research library. The house became a gathering place for colleagues from both their professional networks, hosting informal discussions about criminal justice reform and civil rights advocacy that influenced policy discussions throughout the Washington legal community. Sarah's mother, Elena, visited more frequently now, marveling at her daughter's professional achievements while maintaining the practical perspective that had shaped Sarah's character during childhood. Elena often reminded Sarah that success was measured not just by professional recognition, but by the positive impact on people who needed help most. Those conversations helped Sarah maintain perspective during periods when the pressure and complexity of her investigations threatened to become overwhelming. The Pinnacle case had one final surprise that would cement Sarah's reputation as one of the federal government's most effective financial crime investigators. During asset forfeiture proceedings, Sarah discovered that Kowalski had been planning an even more audacious fraud scheme involving artificial intelligence research grants. Documents seized from his personal computers revealed detailed plans to fabricate breakthrough results in AI-assisted cancer diagnosis, potentially stealing hundreds of millions of dollars in federal funding for artificial intelligence research in healthcare. The planned AI fraud would have combined Kowalski's expertise in medical research fraud with emerging opportunities in AI funding for creating a new category of scientific fraud that could have operated undetected for years. Sarah's discovery of the scheme before it could be implemented prevented massive theft from AI research programs while providing valuable intelligence about emerging fraud techniques in technology-related research funding. Her analysis of Kowalski's AI fraud plans became the foundation for new investigative protocols designed to detect fraud in emerging technology research areas where traditional oversight mechanisms had not yet been developed. Sarah worked with technology sector specialists to understand how AI research operated and how fraudulent schemes might exploit weaknesses in AI research funding and oversight. The AI fraud prevention work led to Sarah's appointment as director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's new Emerging Technology Fraud Division, a specialized unit tasked with investigating financial crimes involving artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and other cutting-edge research areas where traditional investigative approaches were inadequate. The position represented the culmination of her career progression from regional nonprofit fraud to the most sophisticated financial crimes affecting national security and technological advancement. Sarah's new division operated out of a state-of-the-art facility in Quantico, equipped with advanced analytical tools and staffed by specialists in both financial investigation and emerging technologies. Her team included former researchers from major technology companies, academic experts in artificial intelligence and biotechnology, and veteran financial crime investigators who could adapt traditional techniques to novel criminal schemes. The division's first major case involved investigating potential fraud in federal grants for quantum computing research, a field where the technical complexity made it extremely difficult for traditional auditors to verify whether
Reported research progress was legitimate. Sarah's team developed new investigative techniques that combined financial analysis with technical evaluation by quantum computing experts, creating hybrid approaches that could detect fraud in highly specialized research areas. The quantum computing investigation revealed fraud schemes that were even more sophisticated than what Sarah had encountered in medical research, involving fabricated technical specifications for quantum computers that existed only on paper, and fraudulent claims about breakthrough discoveries that were physically impossible with current technology. The criminals involved had exploited the general public's lack of understanding about quantum computing to steal millions of dollars in federal research funding while providing virtually no legitimate research results. Sarah's success in investigating emerging technology fraud attracted international attention as governments around the world struggled to prevent similar crimes in their own research funding programs. She was invited to present her investigative techniques at conferences in Europe, Asia, and Australia, sharing expertise that helped other countries develop their own capabilities for detecting fraud in high-technology research areas. The international work also revealed the global scope of research fraud, as criminal organizations were exploiting differences between countries' oversight systems to move fraudulent schemes across borders when enforcement pressure increased in any single jurisdiction. Sarah's division began coordinating with international partners to track research fraud across multiple countries and prevent criminals from simply relocating their operations when investigations intensified. David's civil rights work had evolved to focus increasingly on technology-related discrimination, particularly algorithmic bias in healthcare and education systems. His expertise complemented Sarah's work perfectly, as they both dealt with how emerging technologies could be used to harm vulnerable populations. Their dinner conversations often involved discussions about how artificial intelligence systems could perpetuate discrimination while being used to commit financial fraud, creating complex challenges that required both civil rights and criminal justice responses. The couple's professional partnership had become a model for how different areas of legal expertise could be combined to address multifaceted social problems. They were frequently invited to speak together at conferences about the intersection of financial crime and civil rights, sharing insights about how systemic fraud often disproportionately impacted the same communities that face discrimination in other contexts.
Sarah's career had come full circle in many ways, from investigating Margaret Whitmore's relatively simple embezzlement scheme to leading federal efforts against the most sophisticated financial crimes involving cutting-edge technology. But the core motivation remained the same: protecting vulnerable people from exploitation by individuals who used positions of trust and authority to steal resources meant to help others. The girl from Pine Ridge Mobile Home Park had become one of the most respected financial crime investigators in federal law enforcement. But Sarah never forgot the lessons learned during childhood about recognizing when powerful people were taking advantage of those who couldn't protect themselves. Those instincts, honed through years of poverty and struggle, continued to guide her work at the highest levels of law enforcement. Her office at Quantico displayed a photograph of the Pine Ridge Community Center built on the site where her childhood trailer had stood, a reminder of how far she had traveled while maintaining connection to the experiences that shaped her character. Visitors often asked about the photo, providing opportunities for Sarah to explain how her background had prepared her for investigating crimes that others might not recognize or understand. Sarah's division had grown to include over 50 investigators,
specializing in different aspects of emerging technology fraud, making it one of the largest specialized units within the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The team's success rate in recovering stolen funds and securing convictions had established new standards for financial crime investigation, with their techniques being adopted by law enforcement agencies throughout the federal government. The work continued to evolve as new technologies created new opportunities for criminal exploitation. Sarah's team was constantly learning about blockchain technologies, artificial intelligence systems, biotechnology research, and other emerging areas where significant federal funding created incentives for sophisticated fraud schemes. Each new case required developing novel investigatory approaches while maintaining the rigorous financial analysis that had been the foundation of Sarah's success throughout her career. Looking back on the journey from her wedding day confrontation with Margaret Whitmore to her current position leading federal efforts against the most complex financial crimes, Sarah reflected on how each case had built upon previous experience while introducing new challenges and opportunities for growth. The skills developed investigating charity embezzlement had proven applicable to disaster relief fraud, international charity crimes, medical research fraud, and emerging technology crimes. The progression demonstrated how expertise and financial investigation could be adapted to address different types of criminal exploitation, but it also highlighted the consistent patterns in how criminals targeted vulnerable populations and exploited positions of trust for personal gain. Whether stealing from local charities or international research programs, the underlying motivations and methods showed remarkable consistency across different contexts and scales of operation. Sarah's success had provided opportunities to influence policy at the highest levels of government, helping to strengthen oversight systems and establish new criminal penalties that would deter future fraud in charitable organizations and research institutions. Her legislative testimony and policy recommendations had become influential in shaping how the federal government approached financial crime prevention and investigation. The impact extended beyond individual cases to systemic changes in how vulnerable populations were protected from financial exploitation. The reforms Sarah helped implement had prevented countless future victims from suffering the kind of exploitation she had dedicated her career to investigating and prosecuting. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.
Family had owned the textile mills that built the town, the banks that funded expansion, the country clubs that kept people like Sarah on the outside looking in. She'd married into even more money when she wed David's father, cementing her position in the social hierarchy that ruled their small but affluent community. David, bless him, tried to defend his wife at every turn. But he'd grown up insulated by wealth and privilege, never quite understanding the subtle cruelties that people like his mother wielded so expertly. When Sarah tried to explain how Margaret's comments felt, David would say things like, "She didn't mean it that way," or "You're being too sensitive." It wasn't malicious on his part, he simply couldn't see the poison wrapped in politeness. The real trouble had started 3 months before the wedding, when Margaret insisted on hosting an engagement party at the country club.
Sarah arrived to find that Margaret had invited half of Millbrook's elite society, but somehow forgotten to include anyone from Sarah's side. When Sarah's cousin Rosa showed up anyway, Margaret made a point of asking loudly whether the valet service extended to all vehicles, her eyes lingering meaningfully on Rosa's 10-year-old Honda Civic parked between two BMWs. That same evening, Margaret had cornered Sarah in the ladies' room, her mask slipping just enough to show the steel underneath. "I don't know what game you're playing," she'd said, checking her lipstick in the mirror with calculated nonchalance, "but my son deserves better than some gold digger from the wrong side of the tracks." Sarah had bitten her tongue then, but she'd also started paying closer attention to Margaret's activities. It was during that closer scrutiny that Sarah noticed the discrepancies. Margaret served on the board of 3 local charities, always making a grand show of her philanthropy at society events. But when Sarah discreetly looked into the organization's finances, a skill honed through years of financial investigations, the numbers didn't add up. Donations were being diverted, grant money was disappearing, and Margaret's personal accounts were growing steadily larger even as the charity accounts shrank. Sarah had initially planned to ignore what she'd found. It wasn't her case, wasn't her jurisdiction, and stirring up trouble would only make life harder for David. But Margaret's behavior at the rehearsal dinner had changed everything. The trailer trash comment was the final straw, but it was what came next that pushed Sarah over the edge. After the wedding party had moved to the hotel bar, Margaret had pulled Sarah aside with a proposition that still made Sarah's blood boil. "Listen, dear," she'd said in that saccharine tone that meant trouble. "I know this marriage is important to you, but let's be realistic. You and David come from different worlds. I'm prepared to make this transition easier for everyone involved." She'd slid a check across the table, $50,000 made out to Sarah Martinez. "Take this, annul the marriage quietly, and we'll all pretend this unfortunate mistake never happened." Sarah had stared at that check for a long moment, thinking about her mother working double shifts, about studying by candlelight, about every person who'd ever told her she didn't belong somewhere. Then she'd folded the check carefully and placed it in her purse. "I'll think about it," she'd said sweetly, already planning how she'd use it as evidence. The wedding reception was in full swing when Sarah decided it was time. She'd endured Margaret's subtle insults throughout dinner, watched her hold court with the other society wives, listened to her pontificate about maintaining standards and preserving traditions. The final performance came during the father-daughter dance, when Margaret leaned over to whisper loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "Well, at least she cleans up better than I expected." Sarah excused herself from the head table, walked calmly to where her purse sat with the other bridesmaids' belongings, and retrieved 2 items, her FBI badge and credentials, and a manila folder she'd prepared weeks earlier. The folder contained bank records, transaction histories, forged signatures, and a detailed financial analysis that would make any prosecutor salivate. She'd spent her honeymoon preparation time building an airtight case against her future mother-in-law. Margaret was regaling a table of socialites with some story about charity work when Sarah approached. The conversation died as Sarah stood there, still in her wedding dress, but somehow transformed. The nervous, eager-to-please bride had vanished, replaced by the federal agent who'd taken down embezzlers, money launderers, and white-collar criminals across 3 states. "Margaret," Sarah said, her voice carrying just far enough to catch the attention of nearby tables, "I believe we need to talk." Margaret looked up with that practiced smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes. "Of course, dear, though I do think this is hardly the time or place for whatever domestic issue you're having." Sarah opened the folder, spreading documents across the pristine white tablecloth like playing cards. Bank statements, charity board minutes, signature comparison analyses. The paper trail of Margaret's embezzlement spelled out in black and white. "Actually, I think this is the perfect time and place," Sarah said, letting her FBI credentials fall open beside the papers. "Especially considering you're under federal investigation for wire fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering." The color drained from Margaret's face as she stared at the badge, then at the documents, then back at Sarah. The other women at the table leaned forward, trying to process what they were seeing. Margaret Whitmore,
pillar of the community, being confronted by an FBI agent in a wedding dress. You see, Sarah continued, her voice steady and professional, when you called me trailer trash, you made a critical error in judgment. You assumed that where someone comes from defines their worth. But what you failed to understand is that growing up with nothing teaches you to notice everything. And I've been noticing your creative accounting for quite some time now. Margaret tried to rally, reaching for her usual imperious tone. This is ridiculous. I don't know what kind of vendetta you think you're pursuing, but... The Millbrook Children's Foundation, Sarah interrupted, tapping one of the documents. $43,000 diverted from educational programs into your personal account over the past 18 months. The Riverside Animal Shelter benefit, $28,000 that was supposed to fund medical care for abandoned pets. Should I go on? The tables around them had gone quiet now, guests straining to hear the confrontation unfolding between the bride and her mother-in-law. David appeared at Sarah's shoulder, his face a mixture of confusion and dawning horror as he took in the scene. "Sarah, what's going on?" he asked, though the evidence spread across the table painted a clear picture. "Your mother has been embezzling money from local charities," Sarah said simply. "Quite a lot of money, actually. The federal investigation has been ongoing for 6 weeks. Margaret's composure finally cracked. "You have no proof. These are fabrications, lies made up by a jealous, vindictive..." Sarah held up a single sheet of paper. "This is your signature on a bank withdrawal form transferring $15,000 from the Literacy Program Fund to your personal account. The signature matches the exemplars we obtained from your mortgage documents. The withdrawal was made on the same day you bought that diamond bracelet you're wearing." Margaret's hand flew instinctively to her wrist where a tennis bracelet, worth exactly $15,000, caught the light. The gesture was as good as a confession. "Furthermore," Sarah continued, "the check you offered me last night, the one where you tried to bribe me to leave your son, that check was written on the account for the Riverside Animal Shelter. You literally tried to pay me off with money stolen from homeless animals." A collective gasp went up from the surrounding tables.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.